I'd like to thank Rich for offering me the assignment of researching and writing a brief history of Church of the Holy City from the time of its late 19th century establishment on 16th Street to the recent sale of our magnificent Gothic temple. He and I agreed that as we seek the more modest accommodations of a townhouse for our repurposed mission, it would be interesting and useful to explore the rich past of our church. Well, I was already acquainted with the general outlines of that history, and I'd been a witness to and a participant in the life of the church over the last 4 decades. Still, I learned much and gained a new appreciation for several of the things that make our church special. In these remarks, I'll comment on 5 takeaways from the extraordinary legacy of past accomplishments on which we can now draw as we renew and redefine the mission of the Washington, D.C. Society of the New Jerusalem. Firstly, from the earliest Swedenborgian presence in Washington, D.C., 2.25 centuries ago, what is immediately apparent is the extraordinary intellectual and moral quality of both its clerical and lay leaders. Many of the founders were eminent figures in the public life of this area. As a 1902 Washington Post article about the first Swedenborgians in this part of the country observed, in this vicinity were men prominent in social and political life, among them Lord Fairfax of Virginia. We discover also that William Cranch, a cousin of President John Quincy Adams, hosted meetings in his home before there was a church building. And Joe Barnard, the writer of that earlier history that Rich has mentioned, and who is largely responsible for creating the church that we have just vacated, was a distinguished jurist. And Reverend Frank Sewell, who led the church in its heyday, was the brother of the 1896 US vice presidential candidate. Sewell, a commanding figure of widely recognized scholarly, musical, and spiritual attainments, was the first minister to occupy the 16th Street pulpit. 2 extraordinary lay leaders in his congregation were Civil War General Reuben Mussey and his wife Ellen Mussey, more about her later, both of them deeply committed to the advancement of African Americans. It suffices to mention 2 outstanding leaders of the post-World War II era. One of them I had the privilege to know personally, Reverend Ernest Martin, served as minister of the church during the tumultuous 60s. With a Protestant chaplain at American University here in Washington, he used religion to help promote tolerance and acceptance of gays, braving disruption of their meetings by the American Nazi Party. Martin also petitioned the White House to end US involvement in the Vietnam War, and he opened the facilities of Church of the Holy City to the Head Start program, defying the threats of some church members to leave the church if Blacks were allowed in. Martin was succeeded by another man of conscience, Reverend Brian Kingslake, who was from England. He continued the engagement with the Head Start program, and he undertook significant involvement with the 16th Street community. Kingslake had a special deep interest in the welfare of Africans and served as principal of the Mookie Memorial College for African ministers during the apartheid regime in South Africa. Second takeaway, the role of women in the Washington, D.C. Society of the New Jerusalem has been noteworthy since 1841, when a Miss Pringle and a Mrs. Milburn were the first Washingtonians to become Swedenborgians. The building of the magnificent Gothic church on 16th Street was made possible by the request of Nancy Scudder, a leading member of the Washington Society. Her insistence that the main sanctuary be built before space for the Sunday school was created, assured that in a time of economic stringency, the new house of worship would be constructed in timely fashion. It's also interesting to note that more than a century ago, when generally speaking, women's involvement in church governance was almost wholly confined to the activities of ladies' aid societies, a third of the members of our church committee were women. One daughter of Reverend Sewell was church organist for Church of the Holy City, and like her father, composed hymns. Another daughter was a widely admired artist from whom Tiffany commissioned works. The aforementioned Ellen Mussey was truly extraordinary. When her husband, General Reuben Mussey, died in 1892, just after organizing the establishment of the first Black Swedenborgian church in Washington, she became the principal promoter of that enterprise. Prior to that, after being denied admission to the law schools then existing in Washington, she studied law in her husband's law office, passed the bar, and was admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. She did not stop there, proceeding to co-found a coeducational law school, the first law school in the world founded by women. Now, while Helen Keller was not a member of our church, it was where she learned about Swedenborg and where she preached. In recent years, when the fate of our church was in doubt, it was largely women whose efforts assured its survival, with Elfa Holloway contributing unstintingly of her time and energies to help us through the wilderness. We are reminded that similarly, women played a critical role in the survival and growth of the early Christian church 2 millennia ago. A third takeaway: the place of music in the life of the Washington Society of New Jerusalem has, from the time of Sewell's ministry, that is the late 19th, early 20th century, been hugely important. From that time until the ministry of Richard Baxter in the 1980s, a choir sang for every church service and presented special choral performances. To give one example, as when Sir John Steiner's composition Crucifixion was presented on Good Friday. Music sustained us during the darkest hours when the church struggled to survive. The joyous Music with the Angels performances by talented and enthusiastic young musicians lifted spirits and energized the small remnant holding on when the odds did not seem in our favor. A fourth takeaway: that's the capacity of our church for progressive and innovative action. We've already seen that the church was advanced in the role that women played in its life from early on. Ernest Martin was not only in the vanguard of those who committed churches to the support of civil rights for Black Americans and for gays and lesbians, but 50 years ago, he projected a vision for the role of the Church of the Holy City, which foresaw exactly what we are now about to realize. Jonathan Mitchell, the first openly gay minister in the Swedenborgian Church, made Church of the Holy City a welcoming place for members of the LGBTQ community. And in the 1970s and 1980s, the Forum, which met before church services, engaged both members of the church and those of other faiths in discussions that drew on Swedenborgian truths to develop understanding of the true purpose of human life on earth and the continuing life after death. Anticipating the Sunday messages of Rich Tafel, the forum's discussions ranged widely, sometimes including contemporary political issues. Fifth and finally, a last takeaway: the notion of a national church has remained part of our identity throughout the years. The idea was never fully and substantively defined, contributing to the disagreement and discord that emerged between the Washington, D.C. church and the national representatives of the denomination. It was a lofty conception, embodied in the grandeur of the magnificent Gothic temple that we have just vacated, but it was not endowed with a developed sense of our role or mission. We now have the opportunity to reimagine a new home, which will be a focal point for developing ideas that can promote spiritually inspired programs to help build local, national, and even international communities. In moving forward, our church provides us with a rich history of accomplishment by which we can be both informed and inspired.
Beautiful job, Malcolm. You took us through a century with those 5 takeaways, and I love how you told personal stories. Some of which I read your text, but I really hadn't remembered the what you've emphasized, which is the role of women, the outreach, creating the first. I think also creating the first kindergarten program for African Americans in DC. At the mission church that was in Florida Avenue. So it's a history of social justice and social change, and way before its time. I hope we can continue that going into the future. I hope we're ahead of our time right now. But I want to open up to any questions anybody has about the history of the church. That was really, you did a great job. Any questions? Well, you're thinking, I do have one quick one. So, when do you see, when do you see the numbers? What were the numbers of the church like when it first opened? How many people came, and when do you see the change in numbers?
Well, at the start of my story, in other words, about 1890, it was around 100 under Frank Sewell. The first two ministers served extraordinarily long pastorates. Sewell was 26 years, and he was followed by Paul Sperry, one of his disciples, who was pastor for 27 years. So between the two of them, more than half a century. And in the history, you may recall, I refer to that as the heyday of Church of the Holy City. And others at the time referred to it as a halcyon time. Those two men had extraordinary reputations that went well beyond the church. They had an important social, even political presence in Washington. And throughout those two ministries, the membership stayed pretty close to 100. It began to decline a little bit before World War II. And then it's interesting, in the 1950s, there was a bit of a jump. It had decreased to something like 35 or 40. In the early 50s, and I remember all of the posters in churches of that time with smiling families, always smiling white families, saying the family that prays together stays together. During that time of affluence, and one thinks of Norman Vincent Peale and his gospel of affluence, there was a bit of a resurgence, particularly among Protestant churches. And so under William Wunsch, who is the pastor after World War II for about a decade, there was something of a renaissance, of a growth of membership. From then, it pretty gradually decreased until the present time. Uh, Through Dick Baxter's ministry, we had generally about 35 people at our services. Um, Jonathan Mitchell, and build it up to about that same number. Um, then it declined a fair amount as we get into the 2000s.
Mhm. Thanks.
So there's an interesting piece that I cite by Jim Lawrence, the president of convention now. Jim wrote a fascinating piece some years ago, which cited the statistical growth and decline of the church. Its heyday was around 1900. in terms of the number of parishes, the number of total members in the country, and from then on it gradually declined.
It's fascinating. Any questions from anybody in the congregation? Glenn?
Malcolm, you spoke of the church seeking a status of some kind as a national church. Maybe I have not captured that phrase exactly, but I'd heard something about that. Can you tell me what that may have meant to the church itself and why it failed to be embraced by the national?
It's interesting because when the old church on Capitol Hill burned in 1889, the membership very soon decided not to rebuild there, but to move to 16th Street, which was the place to build a church if you wanted to have a prominent church, and that is why it is known still today as the Avenue of Churches, or more correctly, the Avenue of Houses of Worship. You go all the way out into Maryland, and there is just an astounding number of Protestant and Catholic churches, Greek Orthodox churches, mosques, Buddhist temples, Jewish temples. It is truly extraordinary. And for anybody who wants to pursue this a little further, a wonderful book was published 2 years ago called 16th Street, The Avenue of Ambitions. And in fact, Elfa Halloway and I are cited because we gave an interview to one of the co-authors. But it is a fascinating story of how 16th Street developed. And it was, I think, in conversations with the Congregationalists who had already decided around 1890 to build on 16th Street that the Swedenborgians learned of that. And they immediately thought that they would establish themselves on 16th Street to have not just a local, but a national presence. And the church, when it was built, and it's interesting to recall that it was built by an architect who was the first head of the School of Architecture at Harvard and himself a Swedenborgian. It was the largest and most splendid Gothic church in Washington when it was built. That was some years before the National Cathedral was begun. So in terms of architecture, it was placed on the avenue of ambitions, where everybody wanted to have a church. And indeed, the term was used significantly in discussions at the time. It was interestingly in my history, which I hope you read when it comes out. It was grandly described as a national church, but the strange thing to me is that it was never there was never set out any set of guidelines as to what national church actually meant. There was, I think, a general agreement that if not every year, then at least frequently, the National Convention would be held at the church. And indeed, in the early years of its existence, there were several meetings of the convention in Washington. But beyond that, and beyond the establishment of a group of a set of trustees who until now have been generally responsible for the church, the national trustees, with a minority coming from our church and the balance from other churches around the country. And even then, the national trustees, their duties were not described with the necessary precision, which, as Rich will attest, has been one of the reasons that our discussions have been fraught with a bit of discord, which now happily is well past us. But neither the general term national church nor the national trustees were ever defined in the specific way that they should have been. And that's why I ended my remarks today by saying that now, at long last, we have an opportunity to set out a mission and to define a role, which will be, as I said, I hope not just national in scope, but even go beyond that.
I would just add to that, Malcolm, that I think right after they built the church, there was a big recession in the United States. And so funding that was supposed to come from national fundraising kind of dried up. And so I think it set into motion a tension between the local group who was saying, "Hey, you're supposed to be, putting some money into this and help fund this," and the national who looked at it and said, "You guys are getting this incredible church that you didn't pay for." And so that created a tension for many, many years, by way of background. I see that Cheryl has a question as well in the chat. And she writes, "Thanks, Dr. Peck. I appreciate the history as becoming part of the CHC community. Prior to this, I was not aware of the Swedenborgian Church. Is the African American Church still in existence?"
Now, Cheryl, it existed for just over a decade. It had two ministers. The second was an extraordinary young man. He was only in his earlier mid-20s when he took over the ministry of the church. And incidentally, the building still exists at the intersection of 10th and V Streets Northwest. But it came into existence in 1892. It lasted for about a decade. And I think the principal reason for the ending of that enterprise was that Reverend Wilson felt a call to return to Alabama, which was where he'd come from, and serving his community there, which was a great shame. He was an extraordinary, charismatic figure who was on the Washington scene, who preached to very large numbers of people outside of the church on 10th Street, was highly regarded, highly respected. But with his return to Alabama, the experiment basically came to an end. Now, other Black churches did follow it and continued to occupy that church until fairly recent times. Within the last couple of decades, it's been sadly unoccupied. But as I mentioned in the history, one thing it did do, and of course, I should back up a little bit and say, sadly, its existence reminds us that that was a day of segregation in Washington. And the sad fact was that there had to be two churches for the two races. But what it did establish beyond any doubt was the appeal of Swedenborgian ideas to Blacks within the community, and the fact that two very able Black Swedenborgian ministers did lead the church during its all too brief existence. I append a 3-page document to the Church of the Holy City, which does give you a brief history of that church.
And Cheryl, just FYI, Malcolm had mentioned that Lord Fairfax, which is of course Fairfax, Virginia, Fairfax County, he was an early Swedenborgian, and he helped fund the original church. 100 years before the Civil War, he freed his slaves based on his reading of Swedenborg, because in Swedenborg's writings, he says that the African race is the closest to God. It has a direct connection. And so the earliest abolitionists, if you ever saw that picture of the slave ship with all the bodies like in like cordwood, that was drawn by a Swedenborgian who was trying to pass the law, change the law in England about slavery. And the early Swedenborgians even wanted to create a country in Africa for freed slaves. And then the largest Swedenborgian churches in the world have been in South Africa and in Africa. But almost every East Coast church that I can think of in the Swedenborgian community had a African American sister church. And so the general who led the African American Civil War soldiers was the one that Malcolm mentioned, that his wife led the cause. He led it. Swedenborgian led those troops, and so they came to him and asked him to help set up a church. after the Civil War. So it's a very interesting history, but then it's not a it's a it sounds like a great history, but then you look a little deeper and you get to the thing, why do they have to be in separate churches? Well, because it was they were still, despite all these teachings, they were still segregationist, and I'm sure racism underneath it probably at some level. So it's pretty fascinating history. Lord Fairfax is very famous, and one of his relatives became Lieutenant Governor of Virginia with the last name Fairfax. And he's a descendant of Lord Fairfax, slaves that were freed. Any other questions? Roxanne?
Um, so, I mean, you've mentioned on so many occasions, Rich, the idea of being peacemakers and the idea of the location of the church kind of situates that possibility. It certainly puts you in a place of opportunity, so to speak. So I'm just curious historically, how these Swedenborgian ministers may have influenced the politics of the day. And, all I hear now is separation of church and state. And so I'm just kind of curious what the history of that was, to know the history of that, to be able to kind of navigate forward as Christians.
So Malcolm, did you see any like from Sewell or anything like that? I know his brother was the vice presidential nominee, but did you see any um, efforts by the Swedenborgian ministers to lobby Congress or other than Ernie Martin, sounds like he weighed on Vietnam, but were they political at all that you know of?
Not so much, although it's interesting to recall that the very first evidence of Swedenborgian ideas coming to Washington goes back to 1802, when the pastor of the Swedenborgian Church in Baltimore came to Washington and preached at the US Capitol to members of Congress and President Jefferson. That was in 1802, well over 2 centuries ago. Um, Sewell's brother, the Sewells, interestingly, come from the same town as the Doles, two of the most important Swedenborgian family, the town of Bath in Maine. And the Sewells were wealthy shipbuilders. The brother of the minister Frank Sewell, curiously, was himself a conservative Republican, but he was put on the same ticket with the populist Democrat William Jennings Bryan, as sort of an effort, I guess, to get support from beyond the Democratic electorate. It didn't get them elected, but that was interesting. But it really didn't have anything to do with Swedenborgianism. It's hard to say. I mean, Swedenborgian ideas have been, seems to me, I think you'd agree, Rich, much more uh, spread in the world through the writings than through preaching. And to the extent that people in political power have read the works of the Emersons and the Kellers and so forth, I suppose they've been in a general way influenced by that.
Yeah, I think, well, one thing is, yeah, when I look at the history, I don't see a lot of engagement on the political front. And it does seem to have pretty diverse political affiliation. So Republicans and Democrats going back over time, if those labels don't really mean much because they flipped repeatedly. So but I know just one anecdote. In my grandfather was the pastor of a church in Philadelphia, and the whole church was Republican, and he voted for Roosevelt, and they withheld his paycheck for a period. And kind of famous, and my dad would tell me the story that he was living hand to mouth, and they would hold his paycheck up when they found out that he didn't vote Republican. So I think it goes back and forth, but I don't see that they were all that political or engaged in the policy world. Frank Sewell was very involved with the Cosmopolitan Club and things like that, which is more intellectual groups. Like Malcolm said, they were respected individuals in the DC society. But I didn't see a real political angle.
So what does that mean for us as Christians moving forward in such a highly politicized environment?
Well, Ross sent me an article this week, which I can put into the newsletter, which said that it described a church that tried to keep both left and right together in the church. The pastor really worked hard at it, and how difficult it is. And so we just had an exchange, because I wonder how we are as a community of diverse viewpoints. And do we, I think that's just the first question, is do we allow diverse viewpoints? I've never been a fan of bringing politics into the church services and so forth, because I think you come here for spiritual edification and you make your political decisions based on what it is. And I think pastors who tell people to vote, I don't like that. So I don't think that's the right way to do it. But I think we should respect that different people would have different views, and they would interpret things differently and go different places. So I think that's and I think that the challenge is always in any group, whatever the majority viewpoint is, the way to check yourself is to see how accepting you are of the minority viewpoint, regardless of what that minority is. So if you're in a hardcore Republican area, how do you treat the Democrat? If you're in a hardcore progressive Democrat area, how do you treat your Republican? I think we do a pretty good job at Church of the Holy City, uniquely. And I do think a lot of pastors in DC, one of the things that young people have told me is they've shopped at other churches in the city, and you kind of get a political agenda as part of the attendance. Like they say, this is what we believe at this church. And it's very much a party line, aligned with one or the other political parties. And I don't think that's a good way to go. And I think that makes us unusual that we don't do that, and we respect that diversity of beliefs.
Yeah, so moving forward as peacemakers, are we secular peacemakers? Are we Christian peacemakers, or humanist peacemakers? Or, because I don't think I can go through life I think if you are to know me, it kind of quickly becomes apparent that I'm a Christian. It's not something that, I don't proselytize, but I don't want to feel like I have to hide it either.
Well, I think it's great to be authentic, but I also think that if you're holding space, if you're facilitating, I think it's also good to figure out what you're in service to the audience, to the group that you're facilitating, or the groups you're bringing together. And I find that your opinion, as I'm saying as a facilitator, like it's less important. It's more important that people feel that they can share their opinions. So you kind of just step back and you're like, I really want to allow everybody to share. And if you as a leader put too much of your thumb on the scale, you actually can intimidate people to say, I can't speak here because clearly this pastor has an agenda. I'm using a pastor because this Christian has an agenda, and I don't feel very welcome. So I think that we have to just kind of, I think the Christianity, the faith will come through in the love. I don't think it has to be articulated as an agenda. Like, yes, that would be my take. Any other questions?
If I could share
Yeah, please jump in.
just a brief anecdote, which was brought back to my memory by the death of President Carter. When I was working with the State Department's International Visitor Program, I had the privilege of arranging a program for distinguished Israelis and Palestinians who were conducting what we called a track 2 diplomacy peace process. In other words, not official, didn't have official standing, but it was meant to be influential. And I sent a letter to President Carter asking if he'd receive us, and he responded positively. And one of the fondest memories of my life was taking that group and sitting for an hour with President Carter, who was enormously well informed on the issues and inspired this group of would-be peacemakers from the Middle East. So he's certainly one of the people we can look to as we envision our future. And the fact
Yeah.
that at this terrible time in the Middle East, we can recall that only 2 decades ago, a little more than 2 decades ago, it was possible for me to lead a group of high-level Palestinians and Israelis. Maybe that gives us a little bit of hope.
I think that's, that gives me so much hope, because certainly, you know, President Carter did not hide the fact that he was a Christian. He was pretty out there with it, yet, you know, he did some amazing things. So I think that's very hopeful.
It is very hopeful. And it's another example of it wasn't just ministers who did things, it was church members who do so many interesting things. And our congregation has so many interesting people doing so many interesting things. So I think it's very exciting. Any other questions? Last question. We have time for one more if there's one more question. Well, you'll get to read the book soon. Malcolm, you did a great job. We really appreciate you keeping this history and holding this history. I mentioned at the beginning of the service that we're looking at some interesting possibilities right now of a new place. So that's very exciting. So thank you, Dr. Peck.
Mhm.
Thank you.